Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm Berit Anderson, the COO of Future in Review. And for those of you who have never heard of Future in Review before, we run the annual FIRE conference, which The Economist has called the best technology conference in the world. We are back in person in 2023, November 6th through 9th in Los Angeles, California. So we hope you'll join us. If you enjoy these conversations, you'll have the chance to meet many of these people in person, hang out and nerd out about the future of technology and where things are going. So the other arm of our business, Strategic News Service, provides its subscribers with the most accurate source of information about the future of technology and the global economy. And if you are enjoying these conversations, you can sign up and become a member of Strategic News Service using the link below this video. So I am here today, I'm going to be talking to Steve Thrall, and Steve is the VP of Development for North America at eleXsys Energy. And Steve and I have been working together for the last year at least to create what we think is the most comprehensive plan to help the United States fully decarbonize the US grid. So Steve, let's talk a little bit about the full decarbonization idea. You know, a lot of people think that it's impossible. Sure. Including many utilities think it's impossible to fully decarbonize because renewable energy is variable, right? So you can't always depend on it being there given changes in weather or climate. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you think, why you might disagree with that?
Sure.
What's missing and what do we need to put in place in order for that to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, on one hand, you're correct that and you know the opinion that decarbonization isn't easy is correct. It's, you know, you have intermittent variable resources, and that's a complete paradigm shift to our traditional fossil fuel based generation system. But it's absolutely possible. It's absolutely necessary. Probably most importantly, that we do decarbonize and transition to renewables. And it's really then just about finding, I guess, the asset mixes for different regions around the world that work, and it's about then balancing those different resources, whether that's wind and solar and all the different sort of renewables. So you get into tidal energy or geothermal, or there's a big conversation of nuclear, but finding all of those asset mixes to be able to get us through to have the generation we require. And then, of course, the other side of that being sort of energy storage and what that looks like to actually getting to 100% renewables. We've seen there's been lots of research and reports that have come out over the last 5 or so years showing that we can quite easily sort of get to 80% renewables today, and that's sort of should be the goal today. That sort of last, say, 10
that's
or 15,
existing technology,
20% is
things that exist
that's
already.
Exactly right.
Just put them in, go for it. We're 80% of the way there. That's pretty good.
Yeah, totally. And I mean that that should be. And I think in a lot of ways is the sort of near-term goal, but we also know that that's sort of not enough. It's ultimately we need to get to 100% renewables, and the technology exists to do it. It's more of a challenge of sort of existing infrastructure and economics behind some of these the technologies and scaling things up. But I'm confident that we're on the right track, and it can be done if we all sort of are working together and pulling on the same rope, so to speak.
So the name of the report that we've been working on together is 100% Renewable, a plan for American energy independence. And this, I think, is really important. People ask me sometimes, like, why do you spend so much time thinking about energy and grid infrastructure? And or how did you choose to focus on this? And the thing that I always come back to is, when you look at the grid is the baseline that allows the United States to decarbonize about 77% of its total emissions.
Sure.
So as we move forward and continue to innovate in things like electric transportation, manufacturing, all of these other factors that require a huge amount of energy, we can electrify all of those things, but if we're electrifying all of those things and the grid itself is still being powered by coal and gas, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, it's just like transferring to another scenario. And so I think, it's important to understand that when we talk about energy use in the United States, that makes up I think a sizable, but probably I think it's about 24% of total US emissions. But by making the transition to 100% renewable energy here in the US, that actually creates a platform for us to reduce our overall carbon emissions by 2/3, or I'm sorry, about 3/4, 77%, over 3/4. So it's really, I think, it's really important for people to understand that, who may or may not be interested in the grid. It's a very complicated system, and it's a kind of hard, there's a lot of moving parts that we've spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about this year. So I'm curious if you can tell me, so Australia has done this much more speedily than the United States.
Sure.
Through no surprise. However, it shares a lot of the same challenges that the US does. It's a very large country. It's very disparate. Like, its cities are pretty spread out. That being said, what is the solar penetration like in Australia now, and how does that compare to the United States?
Sure. So just to sort of, even just before I get to that, I'll just sort of touching on your last comment, which is really the electrification of everything, right? So like at a macro level, decarbonization is about transitioning to renewables, which then means that when you have all of this clean generation, then you can start to electrify the other areas of the economy and society that are still burning fossil fuels. So your natural gas furnace, your gasoline vehicle, all of those things, your stove, there's a whole bunch of things that then, when you have renewable energy, you can then, and this is all at a macro level, this innovation and this transition is happening simultaneously, right? So obviously you're seeing EVs, you're seeing all of that stuff, but then you're seeing heat pumps, and you're seeing the electrifying buildings, and all of that then contributes to how society decarbonizes at a macro scale. So it's with then sort of the backbone of that being that this energy comes from renewable sources,
right?
And that's how you achieve large scale decarbonization. So in Australia, obviously a very sunny place, and so a strong solar resource from that perspective. And so Australia, sort of rewind 10, 15 years, maybe even more, maybe 20 years even, did some innovation from a policy standpoint with making some really sort of lucrative rooftop solar policy that allowed for feed-in tariff rebates. So it basically allowed them to, if you put rooftop solar on your house, and you consume whatever energy you need from this generation from that system, but then you export that excess energy, and the government would pay you quite lucrative amount for that exported energy. And it was just a subsidized program that was really meant to kickstart that solar industry, and it did its job.
It worked.
And so it worked really well, and so the economics behind it were really strong for a homeowner. Electricity prices in Australia are quite high. Again, it sort of goes back to a relatively small population and a really big country and a lot of infrastructure and all of that. So right, so electricity prices were relatively high, and so the economics then, when you started to sort of subsidize that feed-in tariff rate for exported solar, it made a lot of sense. So customers were able to, a homeowner could go and put solar on their roof and have a 3 to 5 year payback. It made it a pretty sort of no-brainer step for lots of homeowners to take, and so then that's and then part of that, the follow-on to that obviously is then as the amount of rooftop solar installations increases, and just the economy of scale of that, it brings down the price of that. And you've seen that globally, how the price of solar has dropped exponentially over the last 20 years. And so it's then really, it just continued to build and build that way. And and is now at a point in Australia where the country as a whole is at like a 30% saturation rate for rooftop solar for residential, homeowners.
Whereas here in the US, we have about 3%.
That's right. Yeah. At a whole. And then, and then in Australia, in some of the kind of higher saturation states, so you think of like South Australia or Queensland, they're like getting closer to 50%, right? So
Wow.
like 1 in 2 homes
Wow.
has solar on the roof. In the US, you think of Hawaii or California, those are also states with high saturations, not nearly that high. But are they, 1 in 5 homes, something like that? Right. Totally, they could be, because they also have strong solar resource there.
So I want to back up just a second, because I'm realizing that, one of the things that's really important about the plan that we have laid out that's really different from what's currently happening in the United States is there's a huge focus on transitioning to a fully two-way grid.
Sure.
So a lot of the policy and funding that's been passed recently by the federal government in the US has been allocated toward what's referred to as centralized renewable energy. And that just means wind and solar farms that are all in one big place. They're used to power the grid, but there are challenges to that, namely time, right? Sure. So it takes an average of 10 years to get permit siting and construction started for a solar farm or a wind farm. We have very little time to actually make this transition if we want to have any chance of kind of maintaining some of the US climate goals. And so a big part of why we're advocating for this two-way grid is because it opens up the opportunity to not just rely on wind and solar farms, which are really important, but to turn every US homeowner into essentially a solar wind developer themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so to go back to Australia has done this, right? They really incentivized the deployment and installment of distributed renewables. What happened?
Yeah, well, I think it really comes down to it being, the customer the homeowner is the one that's driving these decisions, right? So yes, there was the policy side in the early days and some of the subsidies that helped kickstart it all, but now it's all just about the economics and customers doing what they feel is best for them. So it's not completely accurate to say that Australia is going all in on distributed energy and not focused on centralized generation or any of that. They're totally, absolutely still focused on wind and solar farms.
Right.
But what they're also seeing is because of this sort of combination of electricity prices being quite high, cost of solar, coming down, and just it's the economic business case. That along with then sort of this resiliency side, right? You're getting into all of sort of the benefits of distributed energy, and I'm sure we'll sort of get into some of that. It's certainly all in the paper, and maybe we'll talk about it today as well. But then it ends up being, it's the customers that are deciding to put rooftop solar on their roof. It's less about the government saying, hey, we should go and drive a bunch of rooftop solar. This is the way of the future. It's more about customers doing it.
They did put a significant financial incentive in place.
Yes, they did.
Yes, they certainly did.
And it was very, very effective at really sort of kickstarting that industry in Australia and helping, helping customers understand the benefits and the value of distributed energy, both from sort of a resiliency and energy sort of control or security standpoint, but also just the economic side. Really, it's at the end of the day, it's the economics that drive all of these decisions, whether it's for a big financier who's doing or developer doing a wind or solar farm, or a homeowner that's putting 5 kilowatts on their rooftop. If the economics don't work, then none of it ends up happening.
And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, expectedly, it turns out that the grid isn't really, most grids around the world, in fact, are not really built to be fully two-way. And I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit more about what Australia learned about limitations
Sure.
by by incentivizing the deployment of so much rooftop solar?
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally what they learned is that there's very real limitations to the amount of distributed generation that can be installed. The grid, and this holds for grids all around the world, are all fundamentally designed and constructed to have energy flow in one direction. All grids around the world have fundamentally had centralized generation, right? And so
they basically haven't really changed much since they were invented, right?
No, they haven't. The grid, the whole sort of energy sector, as a whole, apart from the last, say decade, has not fundamentally changed. It's always been generation, transport that through the transmission network, transport that through the distribution network, gets to the end use customer. And so that energy always flows one way. And so when you start to, and this is kind of one of the key learnings out of Australia that's really sort of been kind of a canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world when it comes to distributed energy, is that the distribution grid has a really limited hosting capacity for distributed generation, meaning it has the limited ability to handle energy flowing that reverse direction, exported solar. So yes, you can consume all that energy on site, but if you want to export that energy, right, you have solar on your roof and you go to work during the day and your house isn't using very much energy, well, you're exporting that into the grid and that can still be consumed. There's still demand on the network. But if the grid can't handle that exported energy, which was the learnings out of Australia, then you end up wasting that energy. It gets curtailed. There's no great way to handle that. And so Australia was the first in the world to really learn that lesson. And being that when you hit sort of around 20 or 30% saturation levels of rooftop solar, that ends up being about the limit to it. And anything excess of that, you start to have voltage rise and voltage volatility challenges, and the network ends up having to curtail that exported energy, and you're just wasting energy then.
Right, which is, if you're not familiar with like energy jargon, curtailment is basically just when too much energy is transmitted, it just gets dumped essentially.
Yeah, it just gets dumped. It can't flow on the power lines because the infrastructure isn't designed for it to flow in a two-way fashion to have that reverse energy flow, and so it just gets sent into the earth.
So there's a couple of solutions to this that we talk about in the report. One is, I think we need massive investments in energy storage, and there have been a lot of innovations taking place in the world of energy storage to allow us to create energy storage systems that don't rely quite so exclusively on lithium, which is a rare earth metal that can be harmful. A lot of people ask me about that when I talk to them about renewable energy. I think there's a lot of concern about the effects of lithium mining on the planet in general. Of
course. Yeah.
I'm not saying that we're about to transition away from lithium mining in any major way. I think it will continue to be, but we are making big strides in lithium recycling. There are a lot of companies that are making strides in that space. And there are companies that are making a lot of strides in gravity-based energy storage systems. There are new batteries essentially coming into the market through a lot of federal funding.
Yes.
That do not rely on lithium. So I think there's a lot of excitement and a lot of opportunity in the air. It's probably going to be a few more years before those
and long duration storage, right? Lithium ion isn't very sort of well positioned for long duration storage. That's not what it's good at. And that's obviously, to transition to 100% renewables, you need to be able to have energy storage that lasts more than sort of 4 or 6 hours, right? So that's a huge sort of advancement that's moving along. And over the next several years, that'll sort of be overcome and will be in the past, but kind of currently.
So that's one part of it, the storage of that energy. But then you also need to make some adjustments to the distribution grid infrastructure itself.
Yes.
Because even if you're storing energy in an energy storage system of some kind, whether that's a battery or something else, there remain limitations to feeding that energy back into the grid, which makes it really hard for utilities to ever be able to depend on renewables for
100%. There's kind of two parts to that, really. One is that as you go through this process of the electrification of everything, right? That's EVs, it's buildings, it's everything transitioning to electricity. Then the demand obviously increases a lot, right? If you now have a heat pump and an EV, in your house, you're obviously going to consume a lot more electricity. And so the grid is fundamentally designed to meet peak demand, right? It has to, when you flip your light switch, you want your lights to turn on every single time. And so they build the grid so that for that, 15 minutes a year, when demand is the highest, everyone has their air conditioner on, they just got home from work, they start cooking, and demand is the highest, you need to build the grid infrastructure to manage that. And so one of the challenges of the electrification of everything is obviously that then if you have that much more demand, right, everyone gets home from work and they plug in their EV, well, that's a lot of electricity flowing through the grid, and you have to have the infrastructure that's built for that. So on the one hand, you have sort of the need for energy storage and sort of the orchestration of how you use electricity from the standpoint of okay, you need to be able to manage the variability, the intermittency of the generation sources, the wind, the solar, the whatever renewables you're generating electricity from. But on the other hand, it's then how do you use that energy sort of in the most efficient way to minimize the cost to the grid, how much infrastructure you need to build to deliver all of that. And that's where energy storage is also a huge piece of the puzzle, right? It's being able to store that energy to then discharge at different times, or you hear about electric vehicles and time of use rates with, well, it makes more sense to charge your vehicle in the evening because that's when demand is lowest. And you start to then balance out that load profile, which can then sort of ends up ultimately what that's all about is reducing sort of that peak demand infrastructure that needs to get built. So that's one side of it. The other side then being this two-way distribution grid concept. We're seeing that as you electrify the home, the business, all of those things, that's all connected to the distribution network. Mm-hmm. And so if you can then site generation closest to the load, so for instance, rooftop solar, well, then you don't have to transport electricity as far. So there's efficiencies in doing that. You don't need the same amount of infrastructure to do all of that. You can fill a rooftop and export that energy and power your neighbor's house, or you fill a big warehouse and it powers the excess energy from that system powers the apartment complex across the street. And you start
eventually, but I think the problem that we're talking about right now is that we can't do that, right?
Totally. We can't do that because you don't have that two-way grid. You run into that, okay, well, you can only put 20 or 30% of distributed energy on the network before you run into that curtailment problem. And that's obviously a major issue that needs to be challenged, needs to be overcome to really be able to capture the full value of distributed generation and to transition to clean energy effectively.
So Australia has dealt with this problem in some ways, and they're starting to do some experimentation actually with the device that eleXsys, your company, has created. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But your company was created out of this challenge in Australia by a former utility operator or engineer.
That's exactly right.
And I'm curious if you can tell me more about, or tell our audience, I guess, more about what eleXsys does and
why
it's so useful.
So you're right. That our eleXsys technology, we've been, we're more than 10 years into this. And
by the way, this is the reason that we're working with eleXsys on this project, because they are the only company that we know of that has created a solution to this, because Australia is so much further ahead.
That's right. So one of our co-founders, he was a distribution utility engineer for the majority of his career, 35 years or something. And he was tasked with, and keep in mind, this is 15 years ago, but he was tasked with at the time with understanding the impacts that rooftop solar would have on the distribution network. Again, this all lines up with the government doing subsidies and sort of the start of Australia's rooftop solar boom. And so as he started to dig into that, he came to understand, wait a second, the grid isn't two-way, that you have this hosting capacity issue. There's a lot of challenges with this. How do you deal with this? And there's fundamentally sort of two ways that you deal with this. One is you just curtail the energy. You just go, okay, well, when the grid is full, then you can't export anymore.
Throw it away.
That's it. The grid can't handle it. You'll melt the cables basically, or you blow up the appliances, and you just can't do it. You need to just curtail the energy. The other way you do it is you upgrade the grid. You go and put in bigger infrastructure. You go and put in bigger power lines, bigger transformers, and to increase that hosting capacity. The challenge with
which Australia did, right?
Which Australia did, yeah. Australia took a lot of heat a decade ago for what people said was, well, you went and gold-plated the grid. You went and spent billions of dollars upgrading the grid, thinking that would solve the problem. But what you really did is you just marginally increased that hosting capacity. So yes, you increased that hosting capacity by 15%, but rooftop solar continued to get installed. And so in 2 years, you ran into the same problem.
Again.
And then you went, uh-oh, we have to go and upgrade the grid again. So not a sustainable solution. Now the US is starting to run into all of those challenges as well. Hawaii is an excellent example of that.
Specifically because I think, the US is deploying the same strategy at the moment,
Yes.
right? Like a lot of what this new money is focused on is, in addition to wind and solar farms, distribution grid upgrades, which are, to be honest, I want to be careful about how I say this because I think it's really incredible and important that Congress passed this landmark legislation to support the renewable transition. Mm-hmm. And I want to be realistic about the fact that the amount of money that was earmarked in that bill for grid upgrades is nowhere near sufficient to even fully upgrade the US distribution grid in the way that Australia already has, and which failed. It didn't fail, it worked, but
it worked for a short time. So you're right, it's not a sustainable approach to allowing high saturations of distributed generation, and that's what Australia found. Australia is now back to, okay, well, we just have to curtail, because regulators and politicians in society said, whoa, you can't go and upgrade the grid every 3 years. That's outrageous. And that's the same conversations that are happening in the US now. And they're going, okay, well, what do we do differently? Which really then sort of brings us to the eleXsys energy side of things and the solution that we decided that we needed to develop. And so that's what we did. So we fundamentally took sort of the engineering principles from technology, voltage management technology that was used on transmission networks. Mm-hmm. And we reinvented it and miniaturized it to be used on the distribution network. And so what it means is that we're able to, by managing the voltage volatility of solar export, we're able to then increase that hosting capacity to 100%. So we capture the full utilization out of the existing distribution grid infrastructure. So instead of running into the curtailment hosting capacity challenges at 20 or 30%, we're now able to increase that hosting capacity to 100%.
When you say it means that you have a two-way grid. What does that mean? Does that mean that 100% of households can install distributed energy?
It means that there's still physical limitations to how much energy can flow on the distribution grid infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But instead of that physical limitation being, say, 20% DER saturation level, it's now 100%. So we exponentially increase the amount of energy that can flow without having to go and do grid upgrades. It essentially means that you can install so much more distributed energy and be able to capture the full value out of it before you'll ever theoretically need distribution grid upgrades. Now, is there a point where you would need to go and reconductor a line? Yes, maybe, but it's now so far down the path of when that would be the problem that you're faced with, instead of it being the problem today, that it means that you can then totally change the way that you use distributed energy and the value that it can provide in sort of this future, this clean energy mix as you transition to 100% renewables.
So what I'm hearing from you is that there's still a limit at some point, but it buys us a certain amount of time, essentially.
Instead of utilizing 30% of your distribution grid, which is like insane when you think about it, right? If you were an investor and you said, okay, I'm gonna pay, or I mean, this is essentially the job that regulators are doing with taxpayer money. Where they go, okay, yeah, we're going to approve you to do $1 million grid upgrade, and you're only going to utilize 30% of that money instead of utilizing 100% of it. It just doesn't make sense.
So it basically
there needs to be a better
the
way.
full capacity of the grid itself.
Yeah, you get the full utilization out of those grid assets, whether it's the existing grid assets or you've gone and upgraded the grid or done whatever, but you get the full utilization, 100% hosting capacity out of that, which means two-way energy flow, which means you can install a lot more distributed generation, batteries, EVs, all of those things and you can then use them in more innovative ways to help get to 100% renewables and balance the grid.
Now, so how many, like if I'm a utility thinking about putting an eleXsys system in place,
sure,
how many of those do I need? Like,
yeah, so like
let's say I'm trying to outfit the city of, and I know you all have been you've been working with IKEA to install your devices to turn their stores into like energy factories,
virtual power plants.
almost.
Yeah.
Virtual power plants. And you're doing some tests in Queensland. That's right. There's going to be 4 or 5 test sites that the Australian government is deploying across Queensland.
Yeah.
But if I'm trying to power, for example, the city of Los Angeles,
sure,
I'm a utility. What does that look like? How many eleXsys devices would they need?
Sure. So, I mean, the last mile infrastructure in Australia is a little bit different. And when you say last mile, it essentially means sort of from the substation or the distribution transformer onward. It's just a different architecture, although it's all sort of fundamentally the same. But I'll use an Australia example for it. Mm-hmm. So in Australia, for 100 homes, which is typically how many homes are serviced from a distribution transformer, we require one eleXsys device installed on that feeder, and it fixes the voltage problems and the host capacity challenges for all 100 of those homes. So it's incredibly cost effective. And how much does
a single eleXsys do? I mean, clearly we're hoping you're a young company. As you grow and scale, the price is going to go down. But what is the cost of a single eleXsys device?
$10,000.
Okay.
It's nothing in the grand scheme of things. Compared to hundreds of thousands, $1 million to fix the voltage with sort of traditional grid upgrades for those 100 homes.
That's pretty good. I would say that's a pretty good return on investment.
And a traditional grid upgrade, maybe, again, so you're at that 20 or 30% hosting capacity limitation. Maybe that gets you to 50% or 45%. As opposed to a $10,000 eleXsys device and you're at 100% hosting capacity. So it's not even really comparable. It's a complete no-brainer from that side of sort of that. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to talk to you a little bit more about one of the advisors that we recruited who generously volunteered his time to create this plan was Amory Lovins, who was was a co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute. And RMI, he is emeritus, so he's no longer there in an active role, but the RMI has just come out with this new proposal and plan called VP3, focused on virtual power plants. And they're talking about how virtual power plants can help with the US transition to renewable energy. It's very much kind of in line with what we're proposing in the plan that we put together.
Certainly.
What is a virtual power plant? What does that mean?
Yeah, so a virtual power plant, and there's a lot of different definitions. So if you were to Google it, you would probably come up with 5 different definitions. But when I think of a virtual power plant, it's essentially an aggregation of DER resources that can be aggregated to provide
DER being distributed energy resources.
distributed energy resources. So that might be rooftop solar, that might be a home battery, that might be an EV, that might be a smart thermostat, or your pool pump, or a smart plug. There's so many different things, devices, IoT type devices that fall into this category of being a DER asset.
Mhm.
And so the idea with a virtual power plant is that you can combine all of these devices that all on their own just control a tiny little thing. It has no impact on the grid, but when combined all together, they can have a tremendous impact on the grid. And primarily in sort of the eyes of the US market and RMI, they're really coming at it from a energy efficiency, demand response, load flexibility side of things. So being able to, for instance, if the grid is stressed because it's a hot summer day in California and everyone's air conditioning is on and everyone's going to come home from work.
Inflation keeps going up. All these tech companies are cutting jobs.
Exactly. So, when you all come home from work and the grid knows, okay, we're going to have a peak demand event, and we're going to struggle to supply everybody with enough electricity to meet all of the needs that they want to for this 1 hour window, say in the middle of August, right? Then you can call on these assets. They can all be, they're all connected to the internet, they can be, and the utility can call on those assets and say, okay, we want to remotely turn down everyone's air conditioning by 2 degrees, right? The idea being that you're never going to notice, right? You're sitting in your house, you're not going to know that your air conditioning got turned down. And yet by doing that on aggregate, you can reduce the peak demand on the network, which means that the utility doesn't have to spend so much on infrastructure. There's savings there, and the savings get passed on to a customer. And so that's sort of
bundling all of these little tiny kind of energy storage devices that would be tough to rely on for a utility on their own.
Yes.
Complicated, but taking that out of the utilities' responsibility so that they know that they have access to an aggregate of devices. That's
right. Or in a different application, and this is how it's being utilized in Australia and not yet sort of fully utilized in the US, but we're on the pathway to this from sort of a policy standpoint, is our IKEA eleXsys microgrid. That is a virtual power plant. And what it is a large microgrid, a large power plant that's built in on the rooftop in the parking lot of IKEA, but it's in the urban environment. And the utility can call on those assets, primarily being the energy storage that's there, to support the network, but not just from a demand response load flexibility standpoint. So it's not just calling on that to say, okay, we want this battery to power IKEA so that IKEA is not drawing energy from the grid, and that'll reduce the demand on the grid. Instead, and this is sort of a key difference to the US Australia market that's evolving and starts to really paint the picture of what a full virtual power plant can look like. The utility in Australia is able to call on the battery to export energy onto the network. So it can go, okay, we need more energy, or we need grid services, we need frequency control, ancillary services, we need we need more energy.
The RMI example is not quite there yet, as far as
it's not. The RMI example,
just turning off people's devices.
It's really just load flexibility. So it's just managing the load side.
Right. It's managing the demand side rather than the supply side.
Right. So essentially, like put really simply, it's about reducing the amount of energy that a consumer is consuming from the grid at that time. And when everybody does that in aggregate, then less energy needs to flow through the grid, which means you don't need as much infrastructure to deliver that amount of energy. There's less energy needs to flow. And that's all being done because of these VPP devices in aggregation that are able to do that. The other side of that equation, and this is what Australia has figured out and the US is figuring out, this is what FERC Order 2222 is about, and this is the evolution of allowing capturing the full value stack out of DER assets
Right.
is
And
to
by the way,
actually be able to export that energy.
just to cut in, because I don't think that everyone is necessarily as much of an energy nerd as you and I are. FERC, for those of you who are not familiar, is the federal regulatory body that oversees U.S. transmission grid infrastructure, essentially.
ISOs and RTOs, yeah, which again, sorry to be throwing
Independent
acronyms
system
around.
operators and regional transmission operators, which are responsible for moving energy from the point of transmission in the big grid to wherever it needs to be for
correct, through the bulk energy markets and through the
right.
wholesale markets. Yeah, that's right. So that ends up being, that's where you start to get into the realm of being able to capture the full value out of distributed assets and develop virtual power plants in this case that allow you to replace large centralized generation. Or in a lot of ways, it's not so much about replacing it, it's about easing the stress on it, right? So if you're going to electrify everything and have this huge increase in the amount of energy consumption, you're seeing it in the headlines every day with, well, we don't have enough transmission infrastructure, we don't have enough.
I think one of the things that people miss a lot of the time is that, and I've heard this from utilities, so we've talked to a lot of utilities as a part of creating this plan and trying to understand what their challenges are. One of the things that they sometimes complain about is the fact that people expect, I'm putting solar panels on my house, I'm switching to all of these different devices, I have an EV, and yet my power bill is going up.
Sure.
And I think there's, it is important for people to understand that the electrification of everything and the transition to 100% renewable energy does not mean that you're not going to have a power bill anymore. It will go down significantly. But as we make this transition globally, more and more of the things that you were paying for in other ways are getting transmitted to your energy bill, right? So you don't have to buy gas anymore, but you do have to pay for the energy that powers your vehicle.
Sure.
Right. And so a big part of the reasoning behind this two-way grid is it allows you to fully use as much renewable energy as possible to decrease the cost of your energy usage. At a time when it would otherwise be going up exponentially. But it also allows us to make this transition to a fully two-way grid much more quickly. And I think, the important part of this conversation about eleXsys in Australia and learning from Australia's, their experiments and what they've learned already, we want to make sure that we don't spend a lot of time making the same mistakes in the US that have already been made. We know that there are certain challenges that they've come up against in Australia that we will come up against eventually. And so therefore, let's be smart about what we're doing. Let's deploy these low cost, high impact solutions like eleXsys that buy us time and allow us to fully utilize the grid infrastructure that we have. Right? So buy us time to make these grid upgrades, lets us use the full infrastructure, lets us make the transition much more quickly, and therefore builds up the infrastructure that can be used and aggregated into virtual power plants. Or does virtual power plants not actually also apply to like the IKEA model where it's deploying energy back in? It does, right? So it goes both ways.
Totally. Well, and it kind of goes back to the start of our conversation where we said that, we were talking about Australia and why did Australia have this big boom and what's different and some of that. And I said, well, it's all about, it always comes back to the economics, right? It's consumers will be, whether it's a huge solar farm or a small, rooftop solar system on your house.
This is America, and we like money.
Totally, who doesn't? And so rooftop solar is the cheapest form of energy. Like that's like full stop. And that is what's driving customers in Australia and Hawaii and California to install rooftop solar. Not only like that takes out the whole side of the resiliency piece, right? Where customers are getting tired of well, there's a wildfire in California and the utility
Right.
just shut down the
Your power
transmission
goes
network
off, or your,
and I don't have power for 5 days. So they put rooftop solar and a battery on and they go, I'm not dealing with that anymore. Whether it's the economic side for a business or it's a homeowner, right? So like there's all of those pieces as well that start to really show the value of distributed energy. And the reason that it's taking off and booming is because customers are making those decisions.
right.
And customers are saying, I want to put rooftop solar in my house to power my EV. And then the savings just start to really, really grow from there, right? But
So,
you
Steve,
still run into this problem of the two-way grid that needs to be fixed. Otherwise, it costs too much.
I think that's a fantastic point, and I think we should end there. And I would just say, part of, we've talked about a lot of different parts of the grid in this conversation. And I hope that it's been useful for everyone who is watching. One of the things that I think is really important to emphasize as we move forward, one thing that we haven't talked about in full, but you just kind of started to reference, is when we talk about American energy independence, we're not just talking about independence from fossil fuels. We are talking about national security independence and the ability for the US to move forward without having to rely on countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia being able to set artificially energy prices that
or climate emergencies or cyber attacks
every day,
right?
Or cyber attacks or storms or climate disruptions, which are going to become more and more common. But we're also talking about the independence of the average American individual to be able to control their own power supply, right? And what the infrastructure is that would need to be put in place in order for that to work.
And I think just sort of as a last sort of comment, I think part of what we're seeing yes, it's the energy transition and the transition to renewables, but within that, because it's really, it's causing a paradigm shift in how, or a rethink of how do you set up our energy policy, our energy structure, the markets, all of those things. And what keeps sort of bubbling to the surface of it is the need for it to be customer centric, right? That is what customers are saying, is that I want to have control over my energy.
Right. We all want to be able to have control over, and if I highly recommend reading the report. There's a lot of additional details in there about things that are blocking that. Like at the moment, in many places, it's actually illegal for you to create energy and then share it with your neighbor. So we have a lot of recommendations about all aspects of that.
Totally.
And so Steve, I want to thank you publicly for your general patience in helping me understand the U.S. grid, over the grid infrastructure in general over the last year.
It's a complicated space. But you've done a pretty good job of bringing yourself up to speed.
Well, thank you. And we hope that this helps everyone else out there understand what's going on, what's really happening in the U.S. energy market. We highly recommend, so I'll put the link to the report in the comments of this video, or the description of this video, but we also highly recommend reading that RMI paper about virtual power plants.
Very complementary, a lot of alignment.
We have also included a whole, I would be remiss if I didn't not to mention that this is a report that I co-wrote with Robert McClure, who is an independent investigative journalist and co-founder of Investigate West, a nonprofit media company in the Pacific Northwest. But he and I have included a whole list of other reports that you might find interesting if you are indeed wanting to go down the energy nerd rabbit hole.
It's certainly a rabbit hole, yeah.
So, Steve, thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to many more energy nerd out sessions with you in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Berit.